recommends a third COVID vaccine dose for people who are severely immunocompromised. Also ahead, COVID rules relax in Queensland on another day of no community transmission. Another national infection record set in Victoria, more than 1,800 new cases and 5 deaths.
Drop here for our Mobile, who fires Australia in front.
And a record-breaking 11th consecutive win for the Socceroos, defeating Oman 3-1 in Qatar. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Gemma Vaness. A third shot as part of the COVID vaccination program will start being offered from next week, but only for people with weakened immune systems. The federal government insists there are enough doses available to cover the expansion of the program. Political reporter Matthew Doran is in our Parliament House Bureau and joins us now. Matt, who will be able to get access to the boosters in the coming days?
Well, Gemma, at the moment it's only going to be offered to people who have weakened immune systems. So those who have underlying health conditions who need extra protection from COVID-19, because as the Health Minister and the Chief Medical Officer have explained today, the vaccine works in prompting a response from the immune system. So people who have weakened immune systems don't get that same level of protection. They may never get the same level of protection as more healthy Australians, but this third dose, this booster shot, is being offered in a bid to try to bring their protection levels up to a slightly higher standard. That will start from next week. ATAGI, the expert advisory group on vaccines, has provided that advice to government and it's been adopted. So these are people who would have been in phase 1 of the vaccine rollout much earlier in the year will now get access to this third dose. For the rest of the community, however, this is still an ongoing issue. Will people need to line up to get booster shots? It appears likely that they will, although there is some conjecture as to this, if this becomes a yearly occurrence like the flu shot is, or if Australians can get away with having 3 doses of a COVID-19 vaccine in the next year or so, and then move on with the rest of their lives. Certainly, Paul Kelly said, the Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, said that there is still work underway to figure out what the dosage should be into the future. But at the moment, the signs seem to be pointing, and certainly for any decisions on opening up and for easing of freedoms for individuals across the country, it's 2 doses at the moment, a third potentially in the future, and they'll continue to monitor the situation in the weeks and months ahead.
2 doses qualifies you for anything that will depend on being fully vaccinated, and that's the case even with the immunocompromised announcement today. But that's something we'll see over time. But at this stage, 2 doses is fully vaccinated. A third dose will be a booster to assist into the future, subject to ATAGI advice, as we've discussed.
And Matthew, are there any developments on vaccinations for children?
Well, Greg Hunt, the Health Minister, says that he's been in discussions this morning with Pfizer's Australian executives after the company indicated in the United States it had applied to US regulators for approval to use its vaccine, its mRNA vaccine, in children aged between 5 and 11. This is a cohort that has not had any vaccine approved for it anywhere in the world, but Pfizer says that testing in the United States has proven that its vaccine is effective in that group of children. However, in Australia there is not as much of a rush generally when it comes to these regulatory approvals. It does take a little bit extra time, and Greg Hunt is saying that he's asked Pfizer to get on board, and if they do want to apply in Australia they should do so as quickly as possible, but also noting that Australian authorities will be closely monitoring what their US counterparts find in the coming weeks.
They've only just commenced that process with the FDA in America, but they're already engaging with our Therapeutic Goods Administration, and I'm encouraging them to submit at the earliest possible time. We have the supply, and as soon as there is an application and an approval, which will be done as a priority approval, and there is ATAGI advice, we're in a position to provide those vaccinations, which is exactly what we did with 12 to 15-year-olds.
That's the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, speaking earlier today. The government is very keen to spruik the latest round of vaccination figures after what was, as we all know and have discussed at length, a very sluggish start to the vaccine rollout. Greg Hunt saying the last 3 days have been the highest vaccination period since the rollout began, and saying that as the nation starts to move closer and closer to those thresholds of double dose vaccination, that is why we are now seeing this discussion about boosters. Supply is no longer an issue, so this discussion about booster shots for the population can now be had. Gemma?
Political reporter Matthew Doran, thank you. Victoria has set another national COVID case record. 1,838 infections have been reported today. 5 people lost their lives. There are now over 16,000 active cases in the state. 55.6% of people over the age of 16 are now fully vaccinated, and 84.1% have received at least 1 dose. Restrictions will begin easing once the 70% threshold is passed. And for more on this, I'm joined by reporter Leanne Wong in Melbourne. Leanne, there are new mask rules for Victorian children returning to school.
That's right. So all children in grades 3 and above will now need to wear masks indoors when they return to school. Now that comes as children in regional Victoria, more of them return to the classroom as of Monday. And then as from the end of this month, when Melbourne's lockdown ends, more than 1 million students in total will get back into the classroom. Now, for a bit of context, high school kids, they already do need to wear masks indoors anyway. But what this essentially means is that kids from grades 3 to 6 will also have to wear masks indoors, and kids in prep to grade 2, well, it's strongly recommended they wear a mask, but it's not mandated. Let's take a listen to what Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton had to say about why this decision was made.
We've certainly seen in countries such as England or the UK where schools reopened without strong mask use from the get-go, or indeed supported by all of those other layered mitigations such as good ventilation. There was an estimated 8% of students absent from school in those early weeks with suspected or confirmed COVID or as close contacts. So we really want to have these measures in place early on to keep kids in school and to make sure that they're safe in the school environment, as safe as possible. In many states in America, school mask mandates have been put in place and they've helped to reduce transmission.
Now, this mask mandate also comes in as the Victorian government eases some other restrictions. So as of tonight, more regional areas will be let back into the border bubble. That means they can enter and leave without needing a permit. So that's areas such as Benalla, Greater Bendigo, Bloke and Yarriambiack. And also from midnight tonight, well, masks can now be removed outdoors for the consumption of alcohol, meaning that anyone who's going to have a picnic this weekend, they can take their mask off in order to drink some alcohol. So some good news there for Victorians looking to enjoy the weekend.
Leanne, the state's health system, it's starting to come under significant strain.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So right now there's quite unprecedented pressure on Victoria's health system. So as we know, triage tents have now been set up outside multiple Melbourne hospitals to help with overflow and essentially sort through patients a bit more efficiently. So we know that tents have already been set up outside the William Angliss Hospital in Ferntree Gully, that's in Melbourne's southeast, and there are more to come in the coming days. And it also comes as more ADF personnel have been brought in to help ease the strain on Victorian paramedics. So how that will essentially work is that from next week, ambulances will operate with just 1 paramedic rather than 2, and they'll be accompanied by a driver from the ADF or St John's Ambulance or the SES. And that also comes as Victoria's former police chief, Graham Ashton, is set to review the state's emergency call-out operator, otherwise known as ESTA, after revelations that 2 people have died in recent days after their calls to 000 went unanswered for 5 minutes. So it's some significant strain there in Victoria's healthcare system, and it's just raising questions about how many record days of case numbers Victoria's healthcare system can take.
Finally, Leanne, the Premier's in some trouble over masks.
Yeah, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, he's come under fire after there was a video circulating around social media of the Premier not wearing a mask as he approached journalists behind a car park in Parliament. That was on October 7th. And there are now questions about whether or not he was breaching COVID-19 restrictions. As we know, all Victorians aged over 12 will have to wear masks right now, both indoors and outdoors. However, there is an exemption for people such as politicians and journalists if they're about about to speak on camera for ease of communication. Now, the Premier in just the last few minutes has released a statement in response to Victoria Police saying that they will be assessing this footage about whether or not he did breach restrictions. He says that if Victoria Police do believe that he did breach those restrictions, he will pay any fine that is given to him. However, he also did say that if he isn't fined, he will still donate the total cost of a fine to a charity that's currently doing it tough due to the pandemic, because he says he's very sorry that this happened.
Leanne Wong reporting from Melbourne. Well, let's take a look at the numbers in New South Wales now. The state recorded 646 new locally acquired COVID-19 cases and 11 deaths in the latest reporting period. 7 people were not vaccinated, 3 had received 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine and 1 had received 2 doses. It brings the total of deaths from the current outbreak to 414 since it began on June 16. There are currently 856 people with COVID-19 in hospital, including 170 in intensive care. The ACT has recorded 40 new local coronavirus cases. For more on this, I'm joined by reporter Harry Frost in Canberra. Harry, there was concerns about a cluster of cases in special care nursery at a hospital in the capital. What's the latest on that situation?
Yeah, Gemma, a worrying situation. So the special care nursery, that's at the Centenary Hospital for Women and Children, which is part of the broader Canberra Hospital complex. Now, in recent days, a cluster of 5 cases popped up there, including 2 babies. Now, fortunately, there's been no new cases of the 40 new cases today are linked to that cluster, and authorities say investigations are underway. They've confirmed that one of the staff members who's tested positive had been caring for one of the children, and there's also been 5 babies on the ward who've been identified as close contacts, so they are in quarantine. The carers for those children will be able to visit them after they return a negative test result on day 5 of that quarantine, which we understand is tomorrow, but the investigations into that cluster still going on there. When it comes to hospitals in the capital more generally, there's 16 people being treated for COVID-19 in Canberra's hospitals, including 6 in intensive care and 5 of them on ventilation. Of the cases today in the capital, 40 new cases, 21 of them linked to existing or known cases, and some 10 people at least were infectious in the community. They're still investigating a number of others, so authorities are really urging people to continue coming forward for testing if they have any symptoms. The good news in today, though, almost 97% of Canberrans over the age of 12 have now had at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, and 68% are fully vaccinated.
And Harry, what impact will the easing of restrictions in New South Wales have on the ACT in the coming days?
Yeah, it's a bit tricky for the ACT, being a bit of an island within New South Wales, and from Monday those New South Wales residents will be able to move around a little bit more freely, while here in Canberra we're still in lockdown. The authorities are looking at how all of that works. Standing exemptions remain in place, particularly for those border communities around the ACT, places like Queanbeyan or Yass, the townships that are satellites of the ACT, where a lot of people rely on Canberra as a hub, and so there's essential reasons currently for travelling between the jurisdictions like work or healthcare. Authorities are now examining how they will expand those. The travel restrictions within the ACT are looking to be lifted around the 29th of October, and authorities are looking at perhaps expanding the number of postcodes around the ACT where there's a standing exemption, and also changes about the reasons that people can travel for more compassionate reasons. Here's the Health Minister speaking earlier.
Whether we do that in relation to the region as a whole, or whether we do that in relation to some of the things that we know have been causing particular concern for people in terms of being able to see their family and their loved ones, but not then necessarily tourism type activities. So those are the things that we're currently working through.
Yeah, so ongoing issues for the ACT to look at as we move towards the easing restrictions here in the capital. That's scheduled to start on the 15th of October when the lockdown here is lifted. Gemma?
Harry Frost in Canberra, thank you. Some COVID restrictions are easing in Queensland after another day of no community transmission. Stage 3 restrictions will come back for southeast Queensland and Townsville from 4 this afternoon. Capacity limits will increase at pubs, clubs and cafes to 1 person per 2 square metres. Mask rules will relax and will only be needed on public transport, at shopping centres or where social distancing isn't possible. Visitors will also be allowed back into aged care facilities and hospitals.
From 4 p.m. today, that means we go back to those stage 3 restrictions. So our pubs, clubs and cafes can have double the number of patrons, 1 per 2 square metres. For our young people, dancing is back. You can have 100 people to your home. Now, the other issue that I know has really impacted on people not being able to visit their loved ones in aged care facilities and hospitals, they can all go and do that, which is fantastic from 4 p.m. today. And I know that has been very, very difficult on people.
Research shows many families are being pressured to terminate pregnancies once Down syndrome is detected. Down Syndrome Australia has surveyed more than 300 families about their experiences with prenatal screening and says more training is needed for medical professionals. Joining us is Ellen Skladzian, who's the CEO of Down Syndrome Australia. Ellen, the survey found that half of new parents face discrimination and neglect during and after Down syndrome screening. Can you tell us what a typical scenario would be for these parents in that situation?
Sure. So what we heard from families is that they really weren't getting access to the information that they needed. So in a lot of cases, doctors were telling them some very negative things about Down syndrome, and they weren't getting the opportunity to find out more, to meet families, to even meet a child with Down syndrome or connect to the community. And we also heard that even when people made their decision and decided that they did want to continue with their pregnancy, they would be repeatedly asked at every medical appointment whether they wanted to terminate their pregnancy.
So you were seeing instances of subtle and certainly not so subtle encouragement of women to abort a baby with Down syndrome.
Yeah, so from the family's perspectives, what they told us is about 50% of them said that they felt pressure from their healthcare professional to make the decision to terminate their pregnancy.
The fact that we do screen for Down syndrome and 90% of Down syndrome babies are aborted in Australia, does that give doctors the expectation that that would be the choice?
I think doctors make a lot of assumptions. They make assumptions about what life with a child with Down syndrome might be like, and they also make assumptions about the decisions that women might want to make. And the reality is that every family should have the right to make an informed decision about their pregnancy. And they should be able to do that by getting access to the best information they can, the evidence, and actually being able to get a sense of the lived experience of what it's like to have Down syndrome.
How long do couples or women in this circumstance have to make such a decision?
Every situation is different. Some families have told us that doctors have offered to book them a termination almost as soon as they got a diagnosis. The ideal situation is for people to have time to process the diagnosis, get information, and then make an informed decision over time.
So how can the medical profession make this a better experience for parents to make the right decision for them?
So doctors and health professionals need to give families evidence-based, balanced information. They need to connect those families to their local Down syndrome organization where they can get access to really in-depth information, non-directive support, and also meet other families. And then it's so important that once a decision is made, regardless of what that decision is, that families are respected and that choice is respected and not repeatedly questioned.
How can their training change in terms of their manner?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that need to happen. We know that doctors only get about 2.5 hours of training on intellectual disability over the course of their entire curriculum. And so that clearly needs to change. There's a lot to learn about intellectual disability, and you can't do it in just 2.5 hours. And doctors also need to learn how to provide balanced information and support and not be directive and accept what women choose to do. It's important to also recognise that some doctors are doing the right thing, some doctors are providing good information, but we need that to be the norm, not the exception.
And you've made a submission to the Disability Royal Commission. What's in it?
So we've provided the Royal Commission with information about our survey, stories from families. So we've had quite a few families who are willing to share their story directly with the Royal Commission, and also the other evidence and research which has been gathered over the years about the importance of this situation and the need to address it.
Ellen Skladzian, CEO of Down Syndrome Australia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
A new variant of the deadly Hendra virus has been detected in a horse near Newcastle, north of Sydney. Reporter Giselle Wakatama has more.
Yes, certainly the horse industry's fears confirmed yesterday after a lab returned the positive result of this new variant of the Hendra strain in a horse at West Wallsend, which is on the outskirts of Newcastle. A vet had had its suspicions on Tuesday, and that result coming through certainly sending shockwaves, because before now the most southern case was at Scone, which is in the Upper Hunter Valley. But now it's marching south and confirmed in that horse, which has been put down near Newcastle.
How concerned are authorities?
Very concerned, Gemma, because it's a variant strain, and they fear that while this horse, there's been a detection and a positive case, that other horses, they can't put a number on it, but they fear that other horses may have succumbed to this very same variant without obviously getting a diagnosis, but dying under suspicion. And there's concerns that it may even have gone further south, but I guess that will come to fruition as time goes by. But what authorities are doing, they've put this property into lockdown for 21 days, monitoring people going onto it and coming off it, and of course monitoring the horses that remain on that property. So far they're okay, but this thing is deadly, and as we've seen already here, 24 deaths in New South Wales for horses so far.
And what is the message in terms of vaccination?
Certainly vaccines. Vaccination is seen as the best defence. That along with monitoring properties for trees, because indeed the carriers of Hendra virus are flying foxes. So as they're displaced from the urban sprawl, etc., the best bet is keeping animals away from trees, keeping their feed away from flying fox contamination points, faeces, urine, etc. But yeah, vaccine, that's what the message is to get those jabs into horses, because this horse at West Wallsend was unvaccinated.
Giselle Wakatama in Newcastle, thank you. A US Senate committee report has detailed Donald Trump's attempt to overturn his election defeat, saying he grossly abused the power of the presidency. It found Mr. Trump tried to undo the vote and exerted pressure on the Justice Department. He urged the department's leaders to declare the election corrupt and disparaged its chief for not doing anything to overturn the result. It led to department officials threatening to resign en masse, along with two top White House lawyers. The Judiciary Committee chairman says the report shows how close the US came to a constitutional crisis. The pandemic has overwhelmed health systems across the world, and it's having an impact on the environment as well. Indonesia's capital has seen a 500% increase in the amount of medical waste being dumped illegally in land sites and waterways. The United Nations reports a similar problem in 4 other Asian capitals. Indonesia correspondent Anne Barker reports.
Known as pickers, people like Suherman sift through mountains of rubbish for anything they can sell. The pandemic has made the job more dangerous due to an explosion of infectious medical waste dumped illegally. Everything from used masks and protective gear to syringes, vaccine vials, even blood-stained IV drips.
To cut costs, many hospitals, clinics and health centres dispose of their waste illegally, even though it's a grave violation.
It's a problem across Indonesia. On average, almost 400 tonnes of COVID-related waste is being produced every single day. In Jakarta, that's a 6-fold increase. Rivers and waterways too are awash with pandemic paraphernalia, endangering public health. Environmentalists fear infectious pathogens and microplastics from protective gear are entering the food chain.
PPE can be eaten by plankton that are eaten by small fish and then bigger fish caught by humans.
Medical waste is meant to be burnt at high temperatures in incinerators, but there aren't enough. Fuel costs are high and many facilities can't cope with the demand. Residents near this incinerator in East Java have protested for years about the impact of toxic smoke on their health. They say the pandemic has made things far worse.
It smells like IV drips or medicine. It makes you nauseous, gives you headaches and makes people throw up.
President Joko Widodo recently ordered authorities to build 10 new incinerators in Java alone. Far from a quick fix to a problem that just continues to mount. Anne Barker, ABC News.
China is the leading producer of steel, one of the worst industries for polluting the environment. It manufactured 1 billion tonnes last year as the construction industry boomed. As the Global Climate Summit approaches, Beijing continues to grapple with how it can keep its pledges on reducing carbon emissions.
Build and build big has been the mantra in China for decades. It's in their blood. As we crashed a card game in a near-empty shopping mall, Grandad told me 10 years ago this part of the city was fields. It's everywhere in Wuzhou. You hear the trucks, you see the clusters of cranes, all evidence of a country that's still shifting its people to the cities.
This is the top of a 20-floor building. We're surrounded by ones like it, but underneath, there's not much going on. It's pretty much empty. China's solution for years now has been build, build, build. Towers like this. More people come to the cities, more jobs for them, and more steel, of course, to keep the whole thing upright. But if this country is going to get anywhere near starting to reduce its emissions, at least one part of that equation has got to change.
China produced 1 billion tonnes of steel last year, the most ever. Alongside burning coal, it's the most polluting industry here. Some of that steel came from these plants in Wuzhou. They wouldn't let us in though, nor talk to us, but we watched from afar as they're expanding.
这附近的话在建楼房，但是
This is home on the 13th floor for first-time buyer Zhongxin and her boyfriend, and this new addition. She told me building makes things better.
绿化会比较多一点，如果不建楼房的话，那个地址会荒在那里，而且绿化也不是很好。
At just 19 years old, she has 2 jobs and a mortgage. She's living what China's leader Xi Jinping has called the China Dream. The ruling Communist Party's ambition of a moderately prosperous nation that it still controls. But it's facing competing pressures as it tries to make that dream a much cleaner one.
In my conversation with some local governments, they are quite concerning how to achieve the requirements of governments about carbon emission reduction, meanwhile to realize the regional economy growth, because they are facing quite a big pressure to maintain the GDP growth every year.
Timing is the key issue in all of this. Not if China will cut emissions, but when. Real estate agent Zhong told me his country is an infrastructure monster. It will slow down when it's ready.
我的一个态度可能对中国一直不太友好，对吧？可是我觉得自己做，我们中国人自己的事自己怎么做，由不得外国人来说吧。我们国家我觉得做的还是蛮不错的，以后不用去理会一些什么美国之类去无端的指责吧，发展好我们自己是吧？
Build big might not have made China more beautiful, although on some roads you find surprises around the corner. But the people who talked to us were clear. It has made this country better. The Communist Party leaders here now have to work out how to keep this powerhouse economy growing and stick to their promise of a richer country, but make it grow greener and more quickly than it currently is.
The Queen has launched the baton relay for next year's Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. In the first major event at Buckingham Palace since the pandemic began, Her Majesty passed the baton to Paralympic gold medalist Kadina Cox, who carried it for the first stage. It's the beginning of a 269-day journey through 72 Commonwealth nations and territories ahead of the Games in July. The baton will be returned to the Queen at the opening ceremony. Let's take a quick look at the national weather now. Mostly sunny for Brisbane, cloudy with sunny breaks in the afternoon for Sydney, partly cloudy in Canberra, mostly sunny for Melbourne, a possible shower in Hobart, mostly sunny in Adelaide, partly cloudy for Perth, and mostly sunny in Darwin, a top of 35. You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are our top stories on ABC News. The Vaccine Advisory Body has recommended a third COVID vaccine dose for people who are severely immunocompromised. The advice applies to people 12 and over who have certain conditions or are on specific therapies. ATAGI says an mRNA vaccine like Pfizer or Moderna is preferred. It'll provide separate advice for healthcare workers, the elderly and the general population. Restrictions will ease in Queensland from 4 o'clock this afternoon. Capacity limits will increase to one person per 2 square metres. Dancing is back and up to 100 people will be allowed in homes. Mask restrictions are being relaxed. They must still be worn on public transport and in some indoor venues. South Australia has also eased restrictions, bringing the southeast back in line with the rest of the state. Victoria has recorded 1,838 new locally acquired coronavirus cases and 5 people have died in the past day. It's a national high for new infections. The peak is projected to be weeks away, but authorities are confident vaccination rates remain on track to lift restrictions in line with the state's roadmap. And the Socceroos have beaten Oman 3-1 in their World Cup qualifier in Doha. Our Mabil scored in the 9th minute and Oman equalised not long after. The second half goals for Martin Boyle and Mitch Duke sealed the win. Let's take a closer look at the coronavirus numbers now.